Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our event with David Leff and Eric Lehman, authors of New England Nature. A few Zoom housekeeping details before we get started. You are muted and you will remain muted throughout the duration of this event. For optimal viewing, use Zoom view functions in the top right corner of your screen. Select speaker view so that our author is highlighted on your screen. Please ask questions in the chat box function of your Zoom screen. We will get to as many questions tonight as possible. Our mission control is behind the scenes monitoring the event, so you can send your questions that way. If at any time you drop off the Zoom or experience technical difficulties, simply click the link again to be readmitted. And of course, don't forget to purchase New England Nature at rjjulia.com or wesleyanrjjulia.com. You can click on the link in your chat box. We have signed copies available at both stores while supplies last. And now on to the main event. New England is the birthplace of many things, not least of which is nature writing. While we're all familiar with the transcendentalists, the genre is far more varied, and as environmental issues continue to push to the fore, nature writing is more pertinent than ever. In their latest anthology, New England Nature, David Leff and Eric Lehman have collected 60 essays that extol the wonders and beauty of the outdoors, explore local ecology, and call for environmental sustainability. And David and Eric know a bit about the subject. David is an award-winning essayist, former deputy commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection, and poet laureate. He's the author of 6 nonfiction books, 3 volumes of poetry, and 2 novels in verse. Eric is an associate professor at the University of Bridgeport and the author and editor of 19 books, including 7 from Globe Pequot Press, the publisher that has brought us this latest collection. And now, without further ado, I now introduce David Leff and Eric Lehman.
Thank you, Catherine, for that
so
kind introduction. And Eric, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm just going to thank everybody for attending today on this busy day, and I'm very excited to talk to you and get away from the world events and talk a little bit about nature tonight. This is a book that David and I have thought about for a long time, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what how we came to write it and some of the parameters, and then David's going to talk, and then we're going to go back and forth and give you some selections from the book. When I approached Globe Pequot Press to write this with David, we tried to figure out what the best way to do it was, and the publisher ended up giving us some restrictions that at first I was annoyed by, like no poetry. That would be something different. So we snuck in one from Emily Dickinson, but otherwise we didn't have poetry. We also had to take stuff from the sort of first 300 years of New England nature writing. Once you get into the late 20th century there, you start getting into some sticky situations with other publishers. So at first we were a little annoyed by these restrictions as we saw them, but it ended up being a godsend because we were able to really delve into New England nature writing and get into stuff that otherwise we might have passed by because there were so many more famous people to focus on and writers that you guys would have all known their names. And instead we were able to get into some really interesting stuff. This was a collaboration assembling this anthology. I had done a few collaborations before this with my wife, and I think that we ended up being the perfect collaborative partners. I ended up being the person who sort of looked at the breadth of New England nature writing, and I looked at a lot of, I think I had a list of 300 authors at one point, and I looked at all their books, and these were all known New England authors. What David did was the in-depth research, and he really went into things like the old issues of Appalachia Journal and these, Forest and Stream magazine and things like that, And he already had lots of great ideas from his years of investigating nature writing in general. He's a Thoreau scholar as well. So by doing that, we ended up coming up with 60 really great pieces, some of which are from people like Thoreau. And then the problem became that David had to go through, you can see all the books behind him there. He's got like all of Thoreau's work. Well, what do you choose from all of Thoreau's work? And figuring out how we're going to get this one perfect piece that fits with all the other pieces that we ended up choosing. So that was another thing to choose. We also ended up figuring out that we wanted writers in here who were not necessarily thought of as nature writers. We wanted to, of course, have a diverse number of writers, as many women as we could have possibly get in there. Although if we had poets, we could have probably snuck in a few more. We wanted African Americans, we wanted Native American writers, but that ended up being a huge problem for us. And a lot of the nature writing that we found, a lot of the Native American legends were of course secondhand, and that ended up being something that was difficult to manage. So this was a fun process, and I think we ended up getting a collection of amazing nature writing, and that nature writing spans all kinds of things that we might not immediately think. We think of nature writing, we might think of the sort of reflective, descriptive pieces. I walked into the woods today and I thought about, the autumn leaves falling, and it reminded me of death, or whatever. So, so that was, of course, one of the kinds of nature writing that we ended up having. But we also had scientific nature writing. There's also writing, by people who are interacting with nature in interesting and strange ways. Fishermen, runaway slaves, things like that, that we wanted to include. We wanted to include some fiction as well. And so I think we ended up with a pretty good selection. And somebody asked me last week what did I regret not putting in here, and I couldn't think of anything off the top of my head. So I really am pleased with what we've had. And so I'm going to throw it over to David, and he's going to talk a little bit about what makes New England nature writing, and why make a collection about this region at all.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about what makes the New England voice distinctive. It's kind of hard to know exactly, but I think part of it has to do with the land itself. Individuals tend to develop a very intimate relationship with this countryside because it's at a human scale and it's accessible. It may lack the monumental grandeur of, let's say, places out in the western states, but it's a landscape of fine detail and a really astounding, if sometimes subtle, beauty. Also, there's been centuries of use and cycles of exploitation and healing that remain clear and visible for a person who's observant when they're walking in the woods or on the shoreline or on a mountaintop. There's Native American rock shelters and middens, the waste piles of shells and the like. And there's also old farm walls, and from early in the industrial era, old dams and sluiceways that are hidden in the woods, and even 20th century roads that have now been covered up in the forest. Even down in the city of New Haven on top of West Rock, there's Baldwin Drive, which was once kind of a parkway kind of road along the ridge, and the woods have taken it over. It's no longer accessible to traffic. Also, it's a landscape of proximity and diversity. Things are close at hand. There's seashore and mountains. There are deep agricultural soils, such as in the Connecticut Valley. And yet they're very close to the hard scrabble, rocky areas where there's pretty shallow soils and lots of bedrock and ledges poking out. So, you can, in New England, you can wander in a remote woodland and that evening be at the theater or at a concert. You can paddle a wild and scenic river, and later in the day, or in the, go to a world-class museum or take in a ball game, professional ball game. So, this kind of proximity and diversity is important. And it's also a region where nature and culture are very much intertwined. So I think the landscape itself has a lot to do with the distinctive New England voice. The other thing is the culture of New England people. And first off, as Eric mentioned, we owe a lot to Native Americans and their stewardship of this landscape, which we've inherited and which we still share with them. But unfortunately, the writings from this particular era up to the 1920s were really things that were written by other people about Native Americans, not authentic Native American voices. So that is a limitation. Thank goodness archaeology is teaching us a lot about the Native past, as are contemporary Native Americans. But beyond that, New England is a highly educated region and has been from the very beginning. We have a lot of academic institutions here, and ones that started very early in our history. The Puritans who came here were also, relatively speaking for their era, highly educated. And that tends to lead to a culture of reflection about the world around you. So I think that's important. Also, because of the scale of New England, our early farmers toiled on very small parcels of land, and they got to know them quite intimately. In the 18th and 19th century, our seaports brought a great deal of ideas from elsewhere, as well as wealth that allowed people to think about the value of nature. And we're also the heart of the American Industrial Revolution. And that led not only to despoliation of our natural resources, but to a contrary impulse to vary them. I mean, you don't miss something until it's gone. And, Thoreau is a great example of, with the industrial development of his era, he decided that he was going to look elsewhere for beauty, and encountered a lot of things that disturbed his unbridled view of nature. Immigration has brought a lot of different ways of looking at the New England landscape, as well as ideas. And lastly, with the exception of Boston, our cities are small. And so they've always been easy to get out of and get into the countryside. That's how Frederick Law Olmsted, the great park maker, first experienced the landscape as a boy sitting on the saddle with his father and touring around the area near Hartford and beyond. So these factors, I think, are what give New England a distinctive voice, a voice that, shares with other parts of the country and other parts of the world, but is its own unique thing. So with that, we're going to read a few excerpts. And Eric?
Great. I'm going to first share with you an excerpt by this guy, John Jocelyn. And his book was from 1672, New England's Rarities, Discovered in Birds, Beasts, Fishes, Serpents, and Plants of that Country. And so these early sort of documents that came out of New England. We included several of these in there, even though they weren't doing nature writing as Thoreau might have thought of. In this case, Jocelyn was categorizing all the new things that people were, supposedly discovering there. Jocelyn himself is a bit of a mystery. We don't know a lot about him, except that he really pretty much believed everything that the New England people told him. If you've ever read Herodotus and his histories, Herodotus traveled around, goes to Egypt, and he's just like, they're like, oh yeah, the pyramids. Those were like big baking houses where they made bread, or whatever. And Herodotus is like, oh, really? Okay. And he writes it down. So Jocelyn sort of has that problem. And I'm going to read you a few excerpts here that he's writing about black bears. And you'll see that he pretty much is writing down whatever people tell him. He's trying to be scientific. He's trying to give the people back in Europe an idea of what animals they might encounter if they went to the New World. But you'll see it's kind of funny. All right. The bear. They live 4 months in caves, that is, all winter. In the spring, they bring forth their young ones. They seldom have above 3 cubs in a litter, are all very fat in the fall of the leaf, with feeding upon acorns, at which time they are excellent venison. Pretty good so far. Their brains are venomous. Not so sure about that. They feed much upon water plantain in the spring and summer, and berries, and also upon a shellfish called a horsefoot, and are never mankind, i.e. fierce, but in rutting time. And then they walk the country, 20, 30, 40 in a company, making a hideous noise with roaring, which you may hear a mile or two before they come so near as to endanger the traveler. About 4 years since, acorns being very scarce up in the country, some numbers of them came down among the English plantations, which are generally by the seaside. At one town called Gorgiana, in the province of Maine, also called New Somersetshire, they killed 80. That never happened. Their grease is very good for aches and cold swellings. The Indians anoint themselves therewith from top to toe, which hardens them against the cold weather. A black bear's skin heretofore was worth 40 shillings. Now you may have one for 10, much used by the English for beds and coverlets, and by the Indians for coats. One Edward Andrews, being foxed, or drunk, and falling backward across a thwart in a shallop or fisher boat, and taking cold upon it, grew crooked, lame, and full of pain. He was cured, lying one winter upon bear's skins, newly flayed off, with some upon him, so that he sweat every night. So you can see that that's a fascinating mix of fact and fiction there, and really, the story about 40 bears traveling into like a pack and like coming into a town and eating 80 people. Obviously never happened. But these are some of the earliest accounts we get of animals in New England. And of course, we can just turn on Animal Planet and watch this stuff. But this was the Animal Planet of the day, to read somebody's book like this and go, my gosh, what fascinating animals they have there in the New World. Bears roaming in giant packs. So, David, why don't you take us a little farther into the future?
Well, Eric, I just don't understand why you don't find that totally believable. I believe it. I will take us a little bit more into the future. I'm going to read an excerpt from an essay by Noah Webster called Domestic Economy. And it appeared in a couple of newspapers and in the Hartford Courant on April 22nd, 1817. April 22nd, of course, is now Earth Day. So it's kind of an interesting coincidence. Now, we all know Webster from his dictionary, and his birthplace is a museum in West Hartford, well worth visiting. You can go to see his New Haven home, too, where he wrote his dictionary, but you'll have to travel to Michigan because Henry Ford had it deconstructed and brought to his Greenfield village near Detroit. Now, this essay it's really quite remarkable. It's really extraordinary because it very early on, this is 1817, advocates for both energy conservation and sustainable forestry, issues that are still critical to our future. So I'll read a couple excerpts from this essay. Domestic economy. When our ancestors first planted their habitations in this country, the first object was to clear the land for tillage, mowing, and pasture. Wood was an encumbrance, and it was consumed without regard to quantity. In conformity to this object, wide and deep fireplaces were constructed, for it was less labor to roll in heavy logs than to cut and split them. Almost 2 centuries have elapsed since this work of destruction has been carried on without intermission. Our habits have been formed upon this practice, and the annual consumption of 30 or 40 cords of wood by a family is considered necessary and a matter of course. Provident men, however, begin to cast about for a means of saving fuel. In truth, our country cannot sustain the present consumption of wood for a century to come. We must either reduce the annual consumption within the limits of the annual growth, or that time will arrive when we must search the bowels of the earth for fuel. And if we are not able to find it in the interior of New England, we must import it, or we must abandon the soil. It is of the more importance to attend in season to this object, as at some future time we must depend on more for our manufacturers, for our clothing and utensils than we do now. And how are our manufactories to be supplied with fuel? The first object requires attention to nourish and increase the growth of trees for fuel and for timber. Every farm should contain a tract of land covered with trees, the annual growth of which should be equal to the necessities of one family at least. Experienced farmers will best judge the best mode of treating wood for the preservation of the wood and for encouraging the most rapid growth. The next object is to reduce the amount of consumption. Within a few years, much attention has been paid to this object, and many experiments have been made, and some of them with no inconsiderable success. The great point to be gained is the use of fuel is to confine the heat and prevent its escape in the current of air which it generates, and by which combination is supported. In our common fireplaces, a great part of the heat is entirely lost. Then he goes on. Our country has been favored beyond example for many years past in agricultural and commercial prosperity. The effect of this has been not only to furnish the means of improvement, but the means of buying and ambition. We are habitually disposed to spend all we can get, and sometimes more. And under a depressed state of business, these habits become extremely inconvenient. But it is the ordinance of Providence that men should live within their means. We must come to this sooner or later and adapt our manner of life to our circumstances. With a determination to do this, we shall soon find that we are not forsaken by a bountiful providence. But we are not merely to seek the means of subsistence for ourselves. We are not to waste and destroy for the sake of present enjoyment. We must not strip the inheritance of its wood and fences and its timber and leave it barren and impoverished to the next generation. We must not be so improvident as to render our countryside uninhabitable. Cold as the climate is, New England may, with provident management, forever supply food and fuel to a numerous population. Well, the diction is somewhat antique, but the ideas are as contemporary as today. We're talking about energy conservation. we're talking about our forests today with climate change and other issues. He's remarkably prescient. So Eric, you're next.
Great. So the next author I want to share with you is an author that you, again, may not think of as a nature writer, and that is W.E.B. Du Bois from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He was the first African-American to get a doctorate at Harvard. He was a professor at Atlanta University, and his book in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk, was one of the most important nonfiction books of the century. His line, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," became sort of one of the most popular and important ideas. He helped found the NAACP. But he also wrote a lot of different kinds of books, along with sort of social thinking. He wrote some novels. He wrote a biography of John Brown, and he wrote 3 autobiographies, one of which was Darkwater, Voices from Within the Veil. And there's some beautiful nature writing in those books. And so this is a piece we chose of him, where he's coming on a boat from Bar Harbor. I believe he's going back to Portland from Bar Harbor. But and a description of what would later become, of course, Acadia National Park. There, mountains hurl themselves against the stars, and at their feet lie black and leaden seas. Above float clouds, white, gray, and inken, while the clear, impalpable air springs and sparkles like new wine. Last night we floated on the calm bosom of the sea in the southernmost haven of Mount Desert. The water flamed and sparkled. The sun had gone, but above the crooked back of cumulus clouds, dark and pink with radiance, and on the other sky, aloft to the eastward, piled the gorgeous curtained mists of evening. The radiance faded, and a shadowy velvet veiled the mountains, a humid depth of gloom behind which lurked all the mysteries of life and death, while above the clouds hung ashen and dull. Lights twinkled and flashed along the shore, boats glided in the twilight, and the little puffing of motors droned away. Then was the hour to talk of life and the meaning of life, while above gleamed silently, suddenly, star on star. Bar Harbor lies beneath a mighty mountain, a great bare black mountain that sleeps above the town, but as you leave it rises suddenly, threateningly, until far away on Frenchman's Bay it looms above the town in withering vastness, as if to call all that little world petty save itself. Beneath the cool, wide stare of that great mountain, men cannot live as giddily as in some lesser summer's playground. Before the unveiled face of nature, as it lies naked on the main coast, rises a certain human awe. About us beats the sea, the sail-flecked, restless sea, humming its tune about our flying keel, unmindful of the voices of men. The land sinks to meadows, black pine forests, with here and there a blue and wistful mountain. Then there are islands, bold rocks above the sea, curled meadows. Through and about them roll ships, weather-beaten and patched of sail, strong-hulled and smoking, light gray and shining. All the colors of the sea lie about us, gray and yellowing greens and doubtful blues, blacks not quite black, tinted silvers and gold, and dreaming whites. Long tongues of dark and golden land lick far out into the tossing waters, and the white gulls sail and scream above them. It is a mighty coast, ground out and pounded, scarred, crushed, and carven in massive, frightful lineaments. Everywhere stand the pines, the little dark and steadfast pines that smile not, neither weep, but wait and wait. Near us lie isles of flesh and blood, white cottages, tiled and meadowed. Afar lie shadowlands, high mist-hidden hills, mountains boldly limbed, yet shading to the sky, faint and unreal. We skirt the pine-clad shores, chary of men, and know how bitterly winter kisses these lonely shores to fill yon row of beaked ice houses that creep up the hills. We are sailing due westward, and the sun, yet 2 hours high, is blazoning a fiery glory on the sea that spreads and gleams like some broad jeweled trail to where the blue and distant shadowland lifts its carven front aloft, leaving as it gropes shades of shadows beyond. Great writing.
Thank you. Eric mentioned earlier that, when we think of nature writing, we think of personal essays. We might think of some scientific writing, poetry. There's a lot of nature poetry. We don't often think of fiction as nature writing, but there is some very, very beautiful nature writing in fiction, short stories and novels. So I'm going to read an excerpt from a novel by Edith Wharton called Ethan Frome. It was published in 1911. Wharton was born to wealth. She was the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. She designed the mansion where she lived for quite a number of years, and it's now a museum in Lenox, Massachusetts, well worth visiting. And while she really didn't specialize in nature writing, she nevertheless did write about landscape architecture. So she was very sensitive to the world around her. And here in Ethan Frome, you have a character who's inextricably bound to his place, the place where he lives. And such that he and the landscape become almost indistinguishable. And the landscape almost becomes a character, as strong an influence on the action as the people that populate the book. So I'll read a few excerpts, and there's a couple things. There's the word bay referring to a horse. So it's not referring to an inlet on a pond or on the shore. This excerpt is called Starkfield. The next morning, when I looked out, I saw the hollow-backed bay between the Varnum spruces, and Ethan Frome, throwing back his worn bearskin, made room for me in the sleigh at his side. After that, for a week, he drove me over every morning to Corbury Flats, and on my return in the afternoon, met me again and carried me back through the icy night of Starkfield. The distance each way was barely 3 miles, but the old bay's pace was slow, and even with firm snow under the runners, we were nearly an hour on the way. Ethan Frome drove in silence, the reins loosely held in his left hand, his brown seamed profile under the helmet-like peak of the cap, relieved against the banks of snow like the bronze image of a hero. He never turned his face to mine or answered, except in monosyllables, the questions I put, or such slight pleasantries as I ventured. He seemed a part of the mute, melancholy landscape, an incarnation of its frozen woe, with all that was warm and sentient in him fast bound below the surface. But there was nothing unfriendly in his silence. I simply felt that he lived in a depth of moral isolation too remote for casual access. And I had the sense that his loneliness was not merely the result of his personal plight, tragic as I guessed that to be, but had in it the profound accumulated cold of many Starkfield winters. Then a little later in the novel, she writes this. As he lay there, the window pane that faced him, growing gradually lighter, inlaid upon the darkness a square of moon-suffused sky. A crooked tree branch crossed it, a branch of the apple tree, under which on summer evenings he had sometimes found Maddie sitting when he came up from the mill. Slowly the rim of the rainy vapors caught fire and burnt away, and a pure moon swung into the blue. Ethan, rising on his elbow, watched the landscape whiten and shape itself under the sculpture of the moon. This was the night on which he was to have taken Maddie coasting, and there hung the lamp right to light them. He looked out at the slopes, bathed in luster, the silver-edged darkness of the woods, the spectral purple of the hills against the sky, and it seemed as though all the beauty of the night had been poured out to mock his wretchedness. He fell asleep, and when he woke, the chill of the winter dawn was in the room. He felt cold and stiff and hungry, and ashamed of being hungry. He rubbed his eyes and went to the window. A red sun stood over the gray rim of the fields behind trees that looked black and brittle. So this is a novel about some pretty intense characters, and it's got a great story, but the nature writing in it is so vibrant. I mean, this is some of the best nature writing I've ever read. And nature writing about the natural world isn't even the main event. It's a side thing. So you can find good nature writing in some of the most unexpected places. I hope the excerpts that we've read tonight show that to you. So I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And I guess now we'll entertain some questions.
Yes. All right. I love the fact that you included Ethan Frome, or an excerpt from Ethan Frome, in this collection. It is one of my all-time favorite books. And you're absolutely right. I wouldn't have expected it to be included in a nature writing collection, but it makes perfect sense. So thank you both for sharing. So you've shared a few excerpts from the book, a pretty wide range, as we were saying, of nature writing in this collection. And I guess would love to hear a little bit more about how you decided to organize it, a little bit of a run through of the table of contents, and how things are categorized in the book.
Yeah, so we, the table of contents is chronological, so that makes it easier for the reader to just go through and see this long history of nature writing. One of the things I forgot to mention at the beginning was that we also had the challenge of making sure we chose writing from each state, from writers from each state, and also writing that talked about nature in each area of New England. We wanted to make sure we had the coast and the islands, and we wanted to also make sure we had the mountains and the farms and different things, things about animals, things about, so I think that was, something that we found challenging, in addition to what I was talking about before, and, finding authors in this way, finding things that were different enough, and that each piece was its own different little thing, and you weren't going to find like two pieces about hurricanes, for example. There's been a lot of crazy hurricanes, but we wanted to make sure that we have one piece on weather like that. So that became a really fun and challenging part of it. David, did you have something else to add about it?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things about this book is that it's not all literary folk. There are excerpts from geological surveys of states. There are foresters like Gifford Pinchot, who was the first head of the U.S. Forest Service, has an excerpt here. He was born in Simsbury, Connecticut. There's also wildlife biologists, botanists, even P.T. Barnum, who has a diatribe against billboards, is included. So in this book, you are going to discover aspects of nature writing that are not what one usually experiences in a, quote, literary anthology. There are a lot of different disciplines represented here, as well as, explorers, early settlers like Governor William Bradford is represented here. He talks about hurricanes and earthquakes in his diaries, famous diary. So there's a lot to this relatively thin volume that goes beyond the things that most of us consume, including myself, as nature writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you showed such a breadth in just those 4 excerpts that you chose, so I can only imagine what else is included in the collection. And so we joked a little bit before we started the event that you two have remained friends throughout your process, throughout your collaborative process. But could you speak a little bit more to what that process looked like? Did COVID impact it at all? Or were you done with the book before we went into lockdown?
Yeah, we finished on March 1st. So
oh wow.
It was yeah. So that didn't impact us. You know, I thought we pretty much agreed on almost everything. You know, it was, like I said, we found so many, and then we whittled those down, and then we had to change different ones. You know, once you find, oh, this is a better example of this, but we want to include this author. Well, we want to change something up. I mean, so it was really a very organic process, I thought. David, would?
Yeah, no, I agree. I had a lot of trepidation when Eric first proposed this idea, because I'd never done a book collaboratively with anyone else. But as it turns out, I couldn't have chosen or been chosen for a better partner. It really deepened our friendship. We got to explore, I mean, we both love reading and writing, and it got us to explore together a lot of people that neither of us had read before. I would say that the only thing we really seriously disagreed on was, you know, that first excerpt that Eric read. I still maintain that bears can do that.
And how
would
did
it be terrifying if like cadres of bears like attacked villages still and stuff? You know, it's like from
yeah, of course.
Would they evolve the ability to hold pitchforks and torches?
You got it. You understand.
And how did your background sort of factor into it? You know, Eric, you are a professor. David, you have a little bit more of a literary background. How did that sort of play into that collaborative process?
Well, actually, I really don't have a literary I'm a lawyer by trade.
Oh,
I do have a background in the environmental field. I spent 28 years in state government in various environmental capacities. But you know, my literary interests are something that just kind of grew from my teenage years. I was an English major in college, but I don't know. I mean, you know,
he's being modest.
Eric and I, you know, I think we have very compatible interests, and what makes it really satisfying is that while we have very compatible interests, we also both have explored areas that the other has not. So when we're together, we're always learning things.
Yeah, David was much more of an expert on the environmental writing and on, you know, you can see those books behind him there. He had a deep knowledge of Connecticut and New England, you know, people like Gifford Pinchot, for example, and people like Frederick Walcott, and these people that I had never really experienced. And I had, I'm one of my areas of expertise is travel writing and travel. I teach the literature of travel and adventure, and I have written a number of travel guides and things like that. So I came at it from that perspective in some ways, and so I think those strengths both really helped help us come together and find the best selection.
Yeah, that's great. Absolutely. Was there anyone that you discovered during this process, a writer that you hadn't come across before? That answer might be different for each of you, but maybe just someone that really tickled your fancy in the whole process?
Let me see here. I would say early on, when I was first looking at this several years ago, someone like William Hamilton Gibson, who I was completely unaware of. He was born in Sandy Hook here in Connecticut, and was a sort of photographer and a illustrator, and then he has these sort of beautiful little descriptions of nature in Connecticut mostly, and I had never really heard of him ever before, and so for me, we're both from Connecticut, and of course we both love Connecticut stuff, but finding new Connecticut writers was, to me, the most fun part of the book for me. David,
I would say for me, there were a number of writers that I hadn't explored or discovered or even heard of before. Some Eric introduced me to, and others in doing research for the book, like looking in old issues of Appalachia and reading a trip report by someone who ran a boiler company in Boston, Isaac Chubbuck. That was new to me. But I think the thing that I enjoyed the most were familiar names that I didn't realize had a nature bent to some of their writing. Eric introduced me to an excerpt from Helen Keller's work, and how she's exploring with her hands nature. And it was just absolutely astounding because, one of the most important things about good nature writing is that you look at the world in a slightly different way, with fresh metaphors, fresh eyes. And here was a woman who could not see, could not hear, and she's obviously brilliant to be able to overcome so much of that. And she's describing how she's exploring the world tactily. It was a revelation to me. Not that I hadn't thought of that kind of thing before, but just the power of her writing and the fact that that was the way she could explore nature. So, that it wasn't just new names, but discovering familiar names and a new aspect to their life and their work.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one other guest question that we have here, Eric, you talked a little bit in your intro about the decision not to include poetry in the anthology, but if both of you could pick a poem to include, what would it have been?
Oh, there's so many, man.
Just one.
And you can go back. There's poetry by, for example, the Sweet Singer of Hartford, Lydia Sigourney, who, she wrote all this nature poetry at the early 1800s. Obviously, we did sneak in that poem by Emily Dickinson as a sort of, she's the best, but I don't know, David. That's such a there's so many to include.
I would say that it would, I have 3 children, and it would be easier for me to choose among my children than it would to choose a single poet that I would want to include. There are so many that I would want to include, some being very obvious, like Robert Frost, some less so, like Mrs. Sigourney. Mm. And Robert Frost, of course, originally was from California, but he made his name here in New England.
Yeah. We did sneak a couple poets in there as well. Somebody like Amy Lowell, who was the most popular poet of her day, who's been somewhat forgotten recently, but was part of the extended Lowell family of poets. She did do prose poetry. And so we included some of those in there. And so we were able to sneak some more in there.
Yeah, and there are poets in here, but we're selecting their prose works, like James Russell Lowell and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. So there are quite a few poets represented, but not their poetry.
Right.
Maybe that's the next anthology.
It'd be great.
Sounds like it. So now, David, which of your 3 children, we will be sending this to them, by the way. Another question from one of our guests. They have a suspicion, but would like to hear your insight. Why did you not include any contemporary nature writing?
Copyright.
Money.
Yeah, but as Eric pointed out early on, you know, at first we were kind of miffed about that because we would have liked to include the full breadth of New England nature writing. But by limiting it to the 1920s, it really did allow us to explore a lot of writers and give voice in the book to a lot of writers who otherwise no one would ever have heard of, because you know the book had a certain number of words, and we would have had to eliminate so many worthwhile voices who are obscure today. So it really turned out to be an advantage, and it makes this book different than any other.
You know, there are people in here who haven't been published for 150 years. And so that to me is wonderful, to get some of their work back out there into the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Introducing it to a whole new generation of readers is amazing. So looking a little bit to the near future, do you have any other virtual events planned in terms of this book? Maybe online nature writing or poetry courses? Just kind of probably talking more about the book, and other projects in the future in general.
Well, David, can you talk about that other nature-related project that you're working on?
Oh, yeah. I'm working right now on an anthology of poems about Henry David Thoreau. And there probably been more poems written about him than any other non-religious figure. It's quite remarkable. And these poems would go right from his contemporaries like Louisa May Alcott and Franklin Sanborn and Ralph Waldo Emerson, to poets who are contemporary and who are writing today, like Amy Naraki, who has joined us for this Zoom event. So it's a very exciting project, and that one I did have to secure a lot of copyrights for, but fortunately, many poets and publishers were very generous and donated their rights, but not all. So it was a little tricky, and it's something that I've given a presentation to at the Thoreau Society annual meeting, and I'm pretty excited about it. There'll be over 50 different poets represented.
Oh, how exciting. Well, we will all be keeping an eye out for that, I'm sure. Well, David and Eric, I think that about wraps it up for our guest questions this evening. I want to thank you both so much for joining us. And of course, want to remind everybody to purchase New England Nature at RJ Julia or Wesleyan RJ Julia. We will put links again in the chat box, and we do have bona fide signed copies. Eric and David stopped in at our Middletown store on Monday and signed a whole bunch of copies. So those will be available while supplies last. Thank you both again for joining us this evening. Thank you to all of our audience members for joining us, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.